Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of My Name is Dad. And before we get started, let's quickly just go through the sponsor, which is myself, Point B Grading and Turfgrass Maintenance, LLC. I'm a landscape contractor in the Phoenix area, but I specialize in laser grading. But yeah, if you're interested, check out the website, pointbgrading.com, and you can also send an email at pointbgrading@gmail.com. All right, this episode, we are talking about the Jimmy Kimmel, his show being taken off the air, and free speech. Now, because a lot of people are talking about free speech with the, with it having, being part of the Jimmy Kimmel thing. At least some people are saying that. So we're going to try to just break it down here a little bit and really see what's going on behind the screen here. So, if you know Jimmy Kimmel, he is a late night talk show host. His show is on ABC. And most of these late night talk shows start about 10:30 at night after the news comes on at 10, and then the late night shows start. So you got NBC, ABC, CBS, they all got their guy and their show. Jimmy Kimmel has been very critical for a while now, for some years. He's very critical of the right and the Republicans, really like kind of being pushing the line of, kind of being sort of rude and offensive in some of his comments and stuff like that. Now, what happened was that he made some comments on his show that about the Charlie Kirk killer, basically saying I'm paraphrasing here, I don't have the exact quote, but paraphrasing that he was saying that the MAGA people, which is Make America Great Again, were trying to claim that the shooter was not part of MAGA, but Jimmy Kimmel was trying to claim that this person was part of MAGA or was on the right somehow, which is completely not true. There's evidence that he is not. Maybe his parents were or whoever was, but some people on the left were trying to say that this shooter, this killer, was on the right and was an extreme right-wing person, but that's not the case. So what happens is the next day, ABC basically says, we're pulling the plug on the Jimmy Kimmel show. We're not going to air it anymore for the foreseeable future. Not that he was fired, but they're just like, man, this show, we're pulling the plug. Now, also like that morning or, whatever, the guy from the FCC, I don't remember what his name is, but he was on some podcast talking about how he thought that the Jimmy Kimmel show should be fined, or possibly that, like ABC could lose their license over this rhetoric that Jimmy Kimmel has been spewing and the comments he made about the Charlie Kirk killer. So this is the part where the free speech part comes into play. Now, what really kind of was going on was that some of the affiliates that around the country, who they get their material from ABC and then they put it on they put it out on the TV waves, for everyone to watch. Well, some of these affiliates were complaining that they're losing a lot of ratings and audience because of these comments that Jimmy Kimmel has been making over the years, not just the ones about the Charlie Kirk killer. But this one, so the affiliates were complaining that the ratings were going down. They can't sell commercial and ad space for as much money. If they have a lot of viewers, they can sell that ad space for a lot more money. I think it was also kind of already decided that ABC was not going to renew Jimmy Kimmel's contract. And I think that, it's just my opinion, this is what I believe, is that ABC was kind of looking for a reason to kind of get rid of Jimmy. So the affiliates were complaining and they were saying, like, we're losing so many, viewers and audience members, all these things that, like ABC, you got to do something. And I think they just kind of took the opportunity and did that. Now, some are saying that because they were pressured by the FCC, which is the Federal Communications Commission, that they were kind of like bullied into pulling the plug on Jimmy Kimmel show, which if that's true, then that's wrong, because that is definitely a violation of the First Amendment right, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, all those things. So, but again, what I think happened is these affiliates and Disney or ABC, Disney who owns ABC, they're kind of, trying to get away from the wokeness stuff, I think, a little bit now. And the affiliates were complaining that, hey, this show is not doing well, like the Colbert Show. And, ABC, you guys got to do something about it. And I think they just kind of used this opportunity to take the show off the air. I think that's what ABC did. I don't really think it has much to do with the FCC. Now, I will explain kind of like how the FCC thing works. So there's definitely some gray area there with the FCC. Now, the FCC is the commission that gives broadcasting licenses to companies, ABC, NBC, radio stations, all that stuff, right? So and even like when I worked for the city of Peoria, we had a radio that we could turn like the irrigation system on and off, and that we even had to get an FCC license just to broadcast that radio signal, just where we were and everything, because you can't try to use the same radio wave station as somebody else, because this is actually kind of what happened. So at first we had we got our license for this radio station or these radio waves to use our radio to communicate with the irrigation system. And it was actually like a backup, like station for emergency broadcast and like for like ambulances and stuff and police. So it was like, if there's a lot going on with the police and there's like a disaster going on, they have like 3 or 4 radio waves, radio stations they can use. And we actually happen to be on one of those. So we actually had to change ours. So again, that's kind of like the FCC does a lot of that stuff with broadcasting signals and all that stuff. So the FCC gives licenses to cable, satellite, internet, radio, all that kind of stuff. Now the FCC does have some rules if you would like a license. One of them is you have to, your broadcast has to be within the public's best interest, which is kind of vague. But if you ever notice, like when you're listening to the radio, like early Sunday morning, and you're like, this isn't the rock station I normally listen to. They're talking about, it could be like they're talking about mortgages or public health, or it's just a public information, for like a couple hours in the morning. Well, that's part of the rules. To get a license, you have to do some of those things. Other things are like you have to sign on and off. You'll hear like, oh, we need to take a break to, announce, and they'll say like, this is, WKPX. You're listening to this, and it's like, even on TV, they have to do the same thing. And the other things that the FCC does is they do regulate obscene, indecent, and profane content. Now, the FCC does not, or they're not allowed, because of the First Amendment right, they do not censor this stuff, okay? But if you do break some of the rules, they will fine you. And if you are a habitual rule breaker, they will take your license away, okay? So the FCC does regulate this stuff. Now, they're very strict on indecent, obscene, and profane content from the hours of 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., because these are the hours most likely for children to watch, to be watching TV or listening to the radio and doing those things. They are less strict after 10 p.m. To 6 a.m. the next morning. Okay. So again, this is why you have these late night talk shows come on at 10:30. So, but still, they do relax the rules a little bit, but they still can determine or deem something to be obscene, indecent, or have profane content even after the 10 p.m. It's not that it's just, you can just do whatever you want. Again, you're allowed to, they will not censor your stuff, but after it does go on the air and they do get complaints, or there is something that is offensive and audience, affiliates, all these people start complaining, the FCC will give a fine or something like that. The one that always pops to mind is the Janet Jackson nipple slip in the Super Bowl halftime show, which, again, the FCC doesn't know that's going to happen. Nobody kind of knew it was going to happen. But afterwards, they did issue a fine to the broadcast company who broadcast that over the air, right? So this is kind of where the First Amendment part kind of comes in, is that it's a lot of gray area there that, the FCC can fine you and they can take your license away because your license is not a right. Your free speech is a right, but you don't have to do that on the airwaves, right? You don't have to be broadcast or do it on that radio. You can go anywhere in a free speech area and say whatever you want to say. So it's like having a driver's license. It's a privilege, not a right, to have a license from the FCC to have broadcasting rights. Okay. The FCC, they do have the right to issue fines and revoke your license if you are breaking the rules of the agreement that you signed up for, right? Because the FCC does regulate content. They do not censor content, but they will issue fines and you could lose your license because they are interested in protecting children and regulating what the children see if of potentially harmful programming. Also, they just always say that they have this public interest in mind when they issue these fines and things like that. So in the Jimmy Kimmel situation, if the FCC was really pushing ABC to pull the plug on this show, that to me that's a violation of the First Amendment. This is similar to like when President Trump when he was taken off of social media and stuff like that, and during COVID where people were they were censoring or they were blocking information being shared, and they called it misinformation. Now, these companies, Twitter, Facebook, stuff like that, YouTube, they have the right to remove content from their platform. They're a private business. But if the government is coming to Mark Zuckerberg and telling him, hey, we don't want this information out on the airwaves, or we don't want this information being shared, the Hunter Biden laptop story, we don't want this information being able to be shared or distributed amongst the public, they cannot do that. That is a violation of the First Amendment. If Facebook decided they just want to do that on their own, then that's totally fine. That's up to them. But the government cannot, persuade or make rules or laws or anything like that to deny someone free speech. Now, the First Amendment is a little bit tricky in itself. Let me just kind of look it up here. So the First Amendment of the Constitution, the first Bill of Rights, it protects the fundamental freedoms of freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and the right to petition the government. Now, the freedom of speech part in the First Amendment, it protects you from the government. It restricts the government from your right to free speech. Now, again, so this is basically like, you can say whatever you want about President Trump, President Obama, the government, local government, school boards. You can say whatever you want about them. That is your right to free speech, to say that. And they cannot, there are no consequences. You cannot get consequences from the government. They cannot retaliate against you for what you say. You're allowed to say that. This is important because, these places that are totalitarians or dictators and all these things, they censor and restrict information on the news broadcasts or whatever, or, back in the day, you get your head chopped off if you said something bad about the king. So it's a very important thing that we have the freedom of speech. The freedom of press is to, that allows the press to question the government, to investigate the government, and to get that information out to the people and the government can't stop them. They can't limit their access or do anything like that. So freedom of speech protects you from the government only. Okay. Now, you do have the right to free speech in normal settings. Okay. But with consequences. So this is the thing is, Jimmy Kimmel says whatever he says, his company that he works for has the right to be like, no, we don't stand for that. And we're not going to we don't want you to say those things. Maybe it was in his contract, or you could have a contract that says, we don't talk politics or government on this show or at this place of business. We only talk about selling cars, or we talk about comedy, or whatever it is. And that's the right that people have. Now, again, the government cannot force ABC to say, hey, you can't talk about government or politics or anything like that. So it's always the example of, you cannot go into a movie theater and start yelling fire, fire, fire. You will get in trouble for that. Okay. You don't just get to walk away scot-free. Okay. Again, you cannot have like misinformation. You cannot, tell lies about people that directly hurt them. that ruin their reputation and things like that. You cannot spread false information. Now, the thing is, you can kind of spread some false information about the government because they can't stop you, but other people can call you out and prove you wrong and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of people, they get the freedom of speech thing kind of mixed up, that they think they just have the right to say whatever they want. You do, but the government cannot, bring consequences on you if you're criticizing them. You can criticize the government all you want, and they can't do anything about it. Now, you work for a company, and let's say you sell cars. You work for a car dealership, and you're like, these cars suck, and blah blah blah. You know why these cars suck? They're like, well, dude, you're fired because you can't be talking bad about the cars you're trying to sell, right? That's not good for our business. But you can't be like, well, I have the right to free speech. No, you don't. Okay, that's not how that works. So again, that's where this whole thing gets a little tricky. If the FCC was really bullying and went to ABC and said, you have to do something about this, or, they could have said like, or they could have just issued a fine, which they have the right to do, which is kind of a little bit it's a little bit that gray area. Maybe the FCC was like, hey, we're going to fine you because of this. And the ABC is like, no, we'll take them off. But the FCC does have the right to deem things that are inappropriate to go out on the airwaves. So, but I don't really think that that's the case. I think ABC was just waiting for an opportunity to cut ties with Jimmy Kimmel. And because I believe the affiliates were complaining a lot that the show was doing poorly. And that's kind of why, and ABC took that opportunity to get rid of the show so quickly. All right. So I hope that was a little bit informative about the First Amendment, free speech, and a little bit like what's going on in the world, all this stuff. There's a lot of gray area, but please just kind of try to work through it, and just don't just believe one side or the other. If you listen to the Republicans, they don't ever mention the FCC part, but if you listen to the Democrats, all they talk about is how the FCC told ABC to do this, and that's a, violation of his First Amendment right, which it would be, but I don't know if that's the case or not. So again, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, and that's where I like to live my life. All right. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you on the flip side. Thanks. Bye.